The Wells Fargo case presents profound ethical dilemmas that are rooted in systemic misconduct and governance failures. The core principles of integrity, transparency, fairness, and accountability were violated when employees opened unauthorized accounts, misused customer data, and prioritized profit over consumer rights. These actions reflect moral lapses that caused financial harm, it eroded trust, and compromised fiduciary responsibility. Our group is going to present to you what a root cause analysis reveals, that these structural weaknesses that a toxic sales-driven culture, inadequate oversight, and leadership decisions that incentivized unethical behavior brought to this organization. Unrealistic performance metrics and fear of reprisal fostered misconduct, while governance frameworks failed to enforce compliance. Proposed solutions include immediate remediation, customer restitution, regulatory cooperation, and strengthened internal controls. Long-term measures such as ethical training, transparent reporting, and incentive realignment. These steps align with best practices and compliance with ethical finance. So this presentation is going to explore the critical importance of regulatory, legal, and ethical compliance in the financial sector through a case study of Wells Fargo. We will examine how lapses in governance and ethical standards led to significant legal consequences, reputational damage, and regulatory reforms, highlighting lessons for organizations that they still use today. Regulations that will strengthen compliance frameworks and uphold trust. One of the key takeaways I hope you get from today is that strong compliance practices aren't optional. They're essential for maintaining integrity, avoiding costly penalties, and preserving stakeholder confidence. Let's talk about the organization. Wells Fargo is one of the largest diversified financial institutions in the United States. It operates across retail and small business banking, commercial lending, mortgage origination and servicing, wealth and investment management, and various treasury and payment services. The mix of high-volume consumer products and more sophisticated institutional services makes this bank's financial operations both broad and complex. Its business model relies heavily on customer deposits, loan generation, non-interest income, and the management of risk across multiple product lines. Wells Fargo's recent history, however, is shaped by a series of major regulatory and legal failures, most notably in 2016, the sales practices scandal where employees opened unauthorized accounts and engaged in improper consumer-facing behaviors. Due to the intense pressure to meet the sales quotas that the corporation was putting out. This led to extensive enforcement actions from the CFPB, the OCC, the DOJ, and the Federal Reserve. The Fed even imposed an unprecedented asset cap to restrict the bank's growth until it demonstrated stronger governance and risk controls. While the cap was lifted only after measurable improvements, the bank continues to face ongoing compliance oversight and settlements in areas such as advisory services, internal controls, and consumer remediation. And at the heart of these failures were breakdowns in governance, oversight, and corporate culture. Kyoko and Marlowe and Thornton and Lacey emphasize how weak governance structures and corporate transparency increase the likelihood of financial management and public trust erosion. Patterns clearly visible at Wells Fargo. Brooks and Foster and Fine highlight the ethical risks of incentive systems that reward short-term gains at the expense of fiduciary responsibility, which aligns with how high-pressure sales cultures contributed to the misconduct. Similarly, Dahlquist and Knight stress the importance of rigorous financial analysis and transparent reporting. Both are essential for detecting inconsistencies between stated values and operational behavior. The bank's ongoing reforms include their updated policies, revised compensation systems, and enhanced customer remediation. These reflect those principles. And research on organizational culture and well-being from Daltrey and Beams show that ethical leadership, psychological safety, and employee support reduce burnout and misconduct. This is directly relevant to the Wells Fargo scandal because that exposed not only consumer harm, but also the strain placed on employees working under unrealistic metrics. Finally, Roden reminds us that resilience and structural change rebuild trust, and that requires transparent, sustained, and publicly accountable transformation. Wells Fargo's experience illustrates how governance, ethics, culture, and compliance intersect. It stands as a case study in why financial institutions must align all of these things: incentives, leadership, transparency, accountability. This will help maintain public trust and ensure long-term stability. Wells Fargo's regulatory failures were not isolated. They were pretty widespread. Multi-year violations across deposit accounts, credit cards, mortgages, auto loans, and student loans. The most prominent breaches centered on violations of federal consumer protection laws, especially the CFPA, Consumer Financial Protection Act, which prohibits unfair, deceptive, or abusive acts or practices known as UDAAP. In its 2016 consent order, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, concluded that Wells Fargo secretly opened deposit and credit card accounts without customer authorization. They created fake email addresses to enroll consumers in online banking and transferred customer funds between accounts without their consent. These are clear violations of the CFPA, specifically Sections 1031 and 1036A 1B. Beyond fake accounts, Wells Fargo violated consumer protection standards in auto and mortgage servicing. In a 2022 action, the CFPB found that they misapplied auto loan payments, improperly charged fees, wrongfully repossessed vehicles, and denied legitimate mortgage modifications and assessed improper overdraft fees, again violating that UDAAP provision. These actions also contravened obligations under federal mortgage servicing rules designed to protect borrowers from these avoidable foreclosures. The bank additionally breached the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA, through improper credit reporting and through student loan practices that maximized late fees rather than supporting the borrowers that they were supposed to be serving. Wells Fargo 2020 settlement with the Department of Justice also revealed criminal exposure. The bank admitted to creating false bank records and misusing customers' personal information, triggering liability under the FIRREA, which penalizes fraud against financial institutions. One of the most unusual regulatory responses came from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve imposed an asset cap on Wells Fargo in 2018 due to this widespread, pervasive governance and risk management failure. The cap was meant to limit the bank's ability to grow until its internal controls and board oversight were demonstrably improved. The cap's eventual removal came only after regulators determined that the bank had made sufficient progress. The impact of these breaches was extensive. Consumers suffered unauthorized fees, damaged credit, wrongful repossessions, and they were denied mortgage assistance. Wells Fargo has paid billions in civil penalties and restitution. Stakeholders, including employees, shareholders, and communities, experienced reputational damage, leadership turnover, and long-term supervisory scrutiny. The scandals undermined public trust in the banking sector overall and intensified federal oversight of large financial institutions. Altogether, Wells Fargo illustrates how failures in governance, incentives, and ethical culture can translate directly into legal violations and widespread harm. It kind of lets us get a glimpse into how comprehensive regulatory action is and how it's required to restore accountability and transparency.
At this juncture, we move into the ethical dilemmas and the principal violations that occurred within Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo's ethical breakdown originated from its organizational design and disregard to morality. Leadership designed a structure that pushed employees into a direct clash between the bank's profit expectations and its duty to its customers. Executives set cross-selling quotas that they knew employees could not reach through honest work. The demand for 8 products per household was an impossible target, and the pressure forced employees to choose between participating in fraudulent activities or losing their jobs. The same conflict lived at the top. Senior leaders protected short-term stock performances in their own compensation packages instead of the long-term health of the firm or consideration of their employees who had lower positions than them. They framed aggressive selling as competitiveness and ignored the harm to customers. This reflected a breakdown of ethical judgment, where self-interest overtook their responsibility to act with care for the people who trusted the institution. This dilemma exposes a culture that cares more about the results than the way those results were achieved. The shift away from service turned customers into revenue targets rather than individuals seeking trusted financial guidance. That shift violated the basic purpose of banking, period. Leadership used job insecurity as leverage to drive fraudulent outcomes and placed the ethical burden on frontline staff who had little power to resist the systems that they worked within, or they would lose their jobs. Wells Fargo created a system that broke nearly every core principle of corporate governance and internal control. The first breakdown came through a refusal to practice authentic transparency. Leadership inflated cost-selling metrics and marked them as proof of strong organic growth, which was not true. They knew the numbers came from fraudulent activities, yet they continued to promote them to investors, regulators, auditors, and the public as if they reflected genuine value creation. This decision wrapped and warped how the bank presented itself and misled every stakeholder who relied on accurate reporting and everyone who had anything to do with Wells Fargo, whether it was for information, funds, or otherwise. Accountability collapsed next. While an ethically sound organization protects those who report misconduct, Wells Fargo retributed against them instead. Employees who tried to report fraud through the internal hotline were either disciplined or fired, which destroyed the one mechanism that was designed to detect internal abuse to rectify it. Leadership showed every employee that honesty carried consequences, and the message shaped the culture more than any written policy. The bank's leaders also ignored the integrity they claimed to uphold. The code of ethics banned the manipulation of sale numbers, yet management rewarded it and celebrated it. A code loses all authority when leadership contradicts it with their actions, as well as any policy, procedure, or otherwise. Oversight failed as well. The board accepted growth reports that made no economic sense and never pressed for deeper analysis. Complicity. They had a duty to evaluate risk, and they ignored it. These failures worked together, creating a governance structure that protected misconduct and allowed the financial scandal to continue for years.
My name is Dan Miller, and let's move on to the root cause analysis. Walking through scholarly foundations that explain why Wells Fargo scandal occurred using our governance theory, financial ethics, and stewardship frameworks that we've explored throughout our course. The first root cause is a breakdown in corporate governance. Scholars such as Kyoko argue that governance systems must provide clear oversight, internal control, and accountability. At Wells Fargo, the board and senior executives failed to challenge harmful incentive structures or respond early to warning signs. According to Larker, this type of oversight failure reflects a deep organizational misalignment where leadership protects revenue streams instead of ensuring ethical operations. The second root cause is toxic corporate culture. Thornton describes how organizational cultures become dysfunctional when performance pressures outweigh ethical responsibility. Wells Fargo cultivated an environment where unrealistic sales quotas were normalized and employees felt coerced into unethical behavior. This aligns with Brooks, who says that leaders value performance metrics above stakeholder welfare. The culture begins to drift away from stewardship and integrity. The third major driver was misaligned incentive structures. Dahlquist explains that financial systems must reward value creation, not volume creation. Wells Fargo tied compensation to the number of accounts open regardless of customer need, creating predictable distortions in employee behavior. This echoes Carroll's principle that ethical corporate responsibility requires systems that protect stakeholders, not exploit them. Fourth, the scandal revealed a failure of ethical leadership. Kramer describes stewardship or steward leadership as a model where leaders act as trustees, managing resources with humility and accountability. Wells Fargo executives demonstrated the exact opposite, prioritizing short-term revenue over fiduciary responsibility. From a Christian worldview, this reflects a departure from the biblical expectations that is required that a steward be found faithful. Finally, Wells Fargo lacked psychological safety. Beams highlight that in psychologically unsafe environments, employees withhold concerns, enabling misconduct to go even deeper. At Wells Fargo, employees who raised red flags often experienced retaliation. Williams and Luhmann's learning system analysis reinforces this, noting that ethical systems collapse when employees do not trust internal reporting structures. Taken together, these root causes, weak governance, toxic culture, misaligned incentives, ethical leadership, and a lack of psychological safety, all created an ecosystem where misconduct was not an anomaly, but an inevitable outcome. Scholarly literature is clear. When organizational systems drift from accountability and stewardship, ethical failures become systemic, not simply isolated events.
Looking into now some of the proposed solutions and remediations for Wells Fargo, we have two immediate remediation measures that they should take into consideration immediately. Number one, establish an independent ethics and governance oversight authority. Root cause addressed here is governance breakdown and weak oversight. Some of the actionable solutions would be appoint an external ethics and compliance oversight board with full authority to audit sales practices, incentive plans, and executive behavior. Secondly, would be require quarterly ethical performance reports delivered directly to the shareholders and regulators. And then finally, implement open access whistleblower channels directly supervised by the independent board. As stated before, with weak governance and oversight, these things will certainly assist in addressing the first immediate remediation measures. The second immediate remediation measure would be to immediately suspend of all sales-based incentive programs. The root cause addressed here is incentive structures rewarding unethical conduct. Actionable solution would be to freeze all product-based solution quotas and variably pay tied to account creation, replaced with temporary fixed compensation until ethical compensation models are developed, and then finally conduct a forensic review of internal emails, directives, and managerial communications to identify the cultural drivers of misconduct. These two immediate remediation measures will certainly assist Wells Fargo in moving in the right direction of shifting culture. In continuation of these solutions and remediation, Wells Fargo needs to look into the structural long-term prevention measures. There are two of those as well. Number one, board level accountability reform. This will address the lack of oversight. Solutions to this would be require annual board training on CSR, ethics, and governance best practices. This will allow them to have better controls over what will prevent the harm towards stakeholders. Another actionable item here is to build trust. Mandate that 50% of new board appointments have expertise in ethics and compliance and consumer protection, risk, or CSR. This will certainly allow that the board is not just filled with people who are financial people who just want to make money. If you have 50% of your board with ethic background, they will address any red flags that show up regarding policies. And the last one for this section would be introduce board performance audits tied to ethical outcomes and customer protection. The key has to be customer protection. If we aren't protecting the customer, then we are finding ourselves in a place of unethical behavior. The second structural long-term prevention measure would be central cultural rebuilding grounded in moral management and stakeholder respect. Root cause addressed here would be toxic corporate culture. Actionable solutions could be develop annual mandatory cultural training, focus on CSR, stakeholder welfare, fiduciary duties, and ethical finance. Second would be to ensure zero tolerance for retaliation policy for whistleblowers. We heard this earlier for immediate, however, it needs to be a continual addressing when it comes down to the culture. We would like to have a policy implemented where there's a culture that says when you see something going wrong or unethical, that you're allowed to be a whistleblower without being any type of retaliation. Finally, provide public reporting on culture metrics, misconduct cases, corrective actions, and employee engagement. This will also change the culture, recognizing the transparency that is exposed or being visible to all of our stakeholders. Finally, fostering ethical stewardship and transparency and accountability. There are three here, and want to emphasize some of the Christian perspective on this as well. Number one would be re-anchoring governance in moral and ethical management. This creates, in order to do this, creating an independent board could be one of the ways of doing that regarding ethics and risk committee authority. This independent board will assist in not being connected to the day-to-day, but also not being connected to the organizational goal. They're able to actually be an independent perspective in processing what are good ethics and managing risk. The step moves governance from how do we protect earnings to how do we faithfully serve those who entrust us with their money. Second, transparency with company gains and failures. As we see in Leviticus 19:35-36 and Proverbs 11:1. Here they're condemning dishonest measures and stresses fairness with trade, which is part of God's character. Some of the items they could do here would be publish an annual compliance dashboard where things are publicly seen regarding where we're at financially, corrective measures, and how are we doing with audit outcomes. Publicly confess past failures and being open about concrete reforms. Modeling this kind of transparency is consistent with Scripture. Lastly, number three, building a culture of confessed ownership and accountability. Institute a regular ethics and stewardship formation for leaders, including reflection on accountability and truthfulness. The last two would be the strengthening the whistleblower again and explicitly celebrate those who have brought concerns forward and are faithful stewards. We have to recognize, as whistleblower was mentioned 3 times, this is not a tattletale mentality. This is creating a culture where ownership and accountability are key pieces and recognizing that we want to do better. Lastly, this aligns with Paul's vision of stewardship. It is required in stewards that one be found faithful. To whom much is given, much is required, and Wells Fargo can certainly, if not a Christian organization, can use these timeless truths to assist them in moving forward.
Lessons learned from integrated financial leadership. Romans chapter 14 verse 12 reminds leaders that ethical leadership is not optional. It is a mandate. When leaders choose to be led by performance pressure, they remove more accountability. In essence, they remain in survival mode and compromise their integrity. However, Scripture reinforces leaders' call to faithfulness. Paul writes, "Moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful." 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 2. Faithfulness and integrity must be the anchor that guides financial decision-making and organizational policy. One of the key lessons we learned from the Wells Fargo scandal is that financial leadership collapses when it is not rooted in stewardship. Kamer 2018 explains that biblical stewardship goes beyond managing money. Biblical stewardship calls leaders to be rooted in accountability, faithfulness, and responsibility before God. Kamer 2018 reminds us that stewardship is grounded in the understanding that leaders are entrusted with responsibilities that are ultimately from God. This biblical perspective directly contradicts the self-interest, pressure-driven culture that fueled misconduct at Wells Fargo. A second lesson we learned from the Wells Fargo scandal is the centrality of accountability. According to Kamer, stewardship always reflects accountability to God first. Additionally, a third major lesson is the importance of leaders to demonstrate faithfulness and daily responsibilities. Kamer highlights that Paul's writing teaches us that stewardship can be defined as carrying out entrusted responsibilities with consistency and integrity. For modern organization, this means being intentional to create systems, incentives, and structure that protects fairness and truthfulness. In Wells Fargo's case, leadership rewarded outcomes instead of integrity. Ultimately, this case teaches that financial leadership is more than a technical skill. Financial leadership requires a stewardship that remains firmly rooted in accountability, faithfulness, and moral responsibility. Leaders who adopt Paul's stewardship principles serve as leaders who prioritize people, uphold ethical standards, and reflect reverence to God in their service to others. We thank you for your time and attention as we conclude our presentation. One of the clearest takeaways from the Wells Fargo case is that financial leadership must be absolutely grounded in ethical clarity and moral conviction. Throughout this analysis, we were clearly able to see how organizational failures do not begin with isolated decisions. They begin when an organization's culture prioritizes performance outcomes over integrity. This case reinforces the key principle that ethical leadership is not simply about being compliant with laws or meeting external expectations. Ethical leadership is rooted in internal commitments to truth, fairness, and stewardship. We were able to see how leaders unintentionally shape culture. Leaders shape culture by what they reward more than what they say. When leaders elevate numbers over people, they unintentionally create systems where employees feel pressured to compromise their values. We should learn from Wells Fargo. They demonstrate how quickly an organization can drift when ethical guardrails are removed. In contrast, stewardship-centered leadership calls leaders to remain faithful, accountable, and responsible before God. As we discussed earlier, Paul's reminder in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 2, "It is required in stewards that a man be found faithful." This captures the biblical-centered view of what integrated financial leadership should embody. Another key lesson in the importance of being intentional to implement systems that protect truth. Ethical cultures do not emerge by accident. They are created through intentional structures, transparent communication, and consistent expectations. Leaders must design processes that reinforce honesty and fairness. Leaders must remain steadfast to not succumb to pressure to meet performance goals. Ultimately, this case reminds us that financial leadership is more than the ability to manage budgets or measure performance. Financial leadership is a moral responsibility rooted in stewardship, integrity, and faithfulness. Leaders must remain steadfast to ensure their decisions are in alignment with Christian values. When leaders consistently operate in these principles, they build organizations that serve their people well. These leaders remain committed to doing what is right before God and their stakeholders, honoring God first. At this time, we welcome any questions.